Thanks everyone for joining me on my very first episode of Tech Talk Cliff Notes. The idea here is that I'm going to share with you the most critical points from a Tech Talk. While I do encourage you to watch the whole Tech Talk, you may not have an hour or more, or you may be wondering what's covered. So in my Tech Talk Cliff Notes, I will give you the 5 to 10 minute rundown. In this inaugural episode, I will be featuring part 1 in my 12-part Tech Talk series for extending finance and operations apps with the Power Platform. But before we dive into the details, I need to give a huge shout out and thank you to the army of people that helped make this entire Tech Talk series possible. First up is Jason Green from the Finance and Operations Power Apps team. Chris Gardy from the F&O Power Automate team, Murali Kumandari from the Commerce team, Sunil Garg from the F&O Dataverse team, Vasavi Bavirisetti from the PowerCat team, and the one, the only, Murray Fife, global black belt and all-around expert at demoing everything. So, here's how this is going to go down. I have selected 4 slides from the Tech Talk to present to you here and 1 new bonus slide. If you're looking for examples and use cases of how to use the Power Platform, the full Tech Talk is 90 minutes. Yeah, I know, it's really long. But we explore every product combination possible with a handful of ideas and use cases to get you started with each one of the Power Platform products. But let's go ahead and dive into the first slide that I want to highlight for you in the Cliff Notes. This first slide that I wanted to share with you today is really focused in on dual write. It was one of the first slides in the presentation in the original Tech Talk. And I've chosen this one because getting your data into the Dataverse is critical to being able to use the power of the Power Platform. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, dual write is a technology that we use to copy data or duplicate data in a near real-time fashion from finance and operations into the Dataverse. It's typically used in scenarios where you're also using another Dynamics 365 application, but it could be used in scenarios as well where you're building your own Power App, for example. It's important to note that it uses all of our no-code, low-code principles. So it doesn't require you to know how to write X++ or do a lot of technical stuff. It also supports online and offline mode, which we talked about in the original Tech Talk. We also talked about a number of changes that were made to the CDS, which is the old name for the Dataverse, that you'll want to be aware of because there are some differences in kind of how we handle certain types of data. It's important that when you're thinking about dual write, you're going to want to use this in scenarios where you actually need to duplicate the data in both of your applications. Let's go ahead and switch gears and take a look at the second slide. All right, so on this second slide, I chose this one much for the same reason I chose the first one about dual write. Virtual entities are an alternative to duplicating your data into the Dataverse. Remembering that if you want to use the Power Platform to its fullest, you're going to need to get access to your data, right? Data is at the heart of any of these processes. So with virtual entities, the thing I want to point out here is that virtual entities have existed for the Dataverse and customer engagement applications for quite some time, much longer before we introduced the concept of virtual entities for finance and operations apps. One key difference is that with the introduction of virtual entities with finance and operations apps, we do support what are called CRUD operations: create, read, update, delete. That means when you expose a virtual entity out to the Dataverse, you are actually able to modify and update records through the Power Platform connectors, through Power Apps, Power Automate, and so on, with that virtual entity. One of the key benefits to using that virtual entity is remembering I don't actually copy the data into the Dataverse. Instead, that virtual entity appears as if it's in the Dataverse, and we have a kind of query layer, if you will, that allows us to access that data and act upon that data just as if it exists in the Dataverse. Now, one of the key questions that came up during the presentation is related to the ability to trigger a Power Automate flow off of a virtual entity. And while that is not possible, it is actually on the roadmap. It's actually coming up pretty soon this summer. And I encourage you to keep an eye out, as I will be posting some new videos once that new feature is available. We walked through a number of examples of how a user of customer engagement applications like Dynamics 365 Sales or customer service might take advantage of a virtual entity when I expose that data and I needed to make it available to someone that's using a customer engagement app. We also talked through a number of examples of how you might use it with finance and operations users, where you need to make new experiences or extend the existing experiences and embed that back into finance and operations. Later on in the Tech Talk, we do talk a little bit about how you can use these with Power Apps portals. There was a lot of questions around Power Apps portals, and there was another part in the series later on where we deep dived into those Power App portals. So if that's of interest to you, definitely keep an eye out for Cliff Notes on those or check out the full Tech Talk. So let's go ahead and switch gears and take a look at the third slide I selected for you. All right, so environment key facts. This slide comes from pretty close to the end of the presentation, and I chose this one because for my finance and operations friends and consultants out there in the world, Dataverse Environment Management, or at the time it was still called CDS Environment Management, might be a new concept. So there are a few key things that you're going to want to keep in mind about your environments. They are tied to geographic locations. So when you deploy a Dataverse, you're selecting a region, an Azure region that you want to deploy that in. A common question that we get, or that I've seen in some of my fast track engagements, is, well, my finance and operations environment is in a specific data center, but when I deploy my Dataverse, I'm only able to select a region. You definitely want to make sure that you're putting your Dataverse environment into the same region as your finance and operations environment. And you're going to want to test latency and things like that. Now, you don't have the specific control to get it in the exact region when you're deploying it. The kind of basic default logic is that we choose the one that's closest to where your Azure Active Directory is. But if you need to, for performance reasons, you can open a support ticket and request for your Dataverse environment to be moved to a specific data center within your region. It's important to note that different environments have different regions and different types of environments and so on. We dive into all of that information in more detail during the Tech Talk, so I encourage you to check that out. But what I want to do is switch gears and talk a little bit about slide 4, which is closely related to this one. All right, so solution do's and don'ts. This again is pretty close to the end of the original Tech Talk, and most of our Tech Talks have a similar slide included where we talk about some of those best practices, things to make sure you're doing and things to make sure you're not doing. I wanted to include this particular slide because it's so important. And if you're new to the Dataverse and you're used to finance and operations apps, the concept of solutions might be new to you. Really important, make sure you are using solutions. I do strongly recommend setting up Visual Studio and using source control just like you do in all of your finance and operations projects. But some other quick tips: make sure you're using the same publisher and don't include everything in your solution. Just like you wouldn't include the entire AOT in your F&O solutions, only include the assets and the objects that you're actually making changes to. Make sure you're also using managed solutions and automate your ALM using the build automation tools along with the solution checker and the solution packager. Some things to make sure you're not doing is don't use the default publisher or multiple publishers. And don't just include the entire entity because you added one field to it. And don't click the add all assets button. Not a good idea. And don't use unsupported customization techniques. So these are just a few of those key quick tips, best practices that you're going to want to make sure you're using with your Dataverse solutions that go along with your finance and operations application lifecycle management story. And now for the bonus slide. 3 questions. There was a lot more than 3 questions, and there was probably honestly more than 3 that were unanswered, but I chose 3 that kind of came up, and there was a lot of related questions on this. So first question that I'm going to answer was, is it possible to integrate between AX 2012 R3 CU9 and Dynamics 365 Human Resources? Wow, that was a really specific question, but short of the answer is yes. It is possible to integrate between really anything on-premise, including AX 2012 or even AX 2009. The key here is that you're going to need to use something called an on-premise data gateway. I'll make sure to post a link to that in the chat below, so check it out. And once you have that on-premise data gateway, then you can make a connection to whatever your on-premise data source is. With AX 2012 and 2009, that's going to be a SQL Server connection. But if you have other on-premise products that you're trying to integrate with, like an SAP or an Oracle or some other type of data source, remember the Power Platform has more than 400 connectors that you can use to connect to those things. And if it's on-premise, you get to it through your on-premise data connector. Now, the second question that came up, and licensing questions always come up. And so, what licenses are required for Power Apps and Power Automate with Dynamics 365? The short answer is there are no additional licenses required to use Power Apps and Power Automate. However, there are some restrictions about how you can use your kind of use rights with these different Power Platform components. So for Power Apps and Power Automate, no additional licensing required, but if you're doing something that's outside of those use rights, you may need to do something. I'm also going to be posting a link in the chat below to the frequently asked questions and the licensing guide. On page 6 and page 13 of that licensing guide is where you're going to find the specific guidance and details about what exactly is included with your Dynamics 365 licensing. And the third and final question we're going to answer today is, Power Automate says you cannot use virtual entities as triggers. Anything planned to fix this? You're correct. And I did mention this earlier, even in today's quick Cliff Notes. The great news is that we do actually have something on our roadmap. At the time that the TechTalk was published, it was not on the roadmap and we were not publicly speaking about it, but we do have new functionality coming in our roadmap to expose business events, the framework that we're used to in finance and operations on the Dataverse. And at that point, you will be able to use virtual entities as a trigger in a Power Automate flow. So thanks for joining me. Check out and subscribe, add your notifications, and use the links to help get you more information about using the Power Platform to extend finance and operations.